Hello, parents and guardians, and welcome back to another Discipleship Debrief. This past Sunday, CBC Youth continued our series in the book of Ecclesiastes, wrapping up chapter 1, and then also taking verses from chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 12 to have a complete discussion on wisdom, and not godly, spiritual wisdom, but actually worldly wisdom or knowledge, kind of how the preacher uses it interchangeably with knowledge or experience. And so the preacher in these passages talked about really the inherent issues with knowledge alone or experience alone, seeking satisfaction and purpose in those things. And he identified first their problems, and then in taking their problems and discussing them, we identified how Christ solves those problems with worldly wisdom or knowledge or experience. And so the problems with knowledge and experience, with seeking those outside of God, right? Because we want to put them back in their proper place and say that we seek knowledge to know more about God. We seek experiences to know more about God. When they are put in the place of God, they replace God, they have some very big issues. The first of which being that they're limited. Knowledge and experience are inherently limited. We see this in chapter 1. The preacher talks about the fact that knowledge and experience, they can only show us what's wrong with the world. They can only show us problems. They can't show us genuine solutions. In chapter 1, verse 15, the preacher says, "What is crooked cannot be made straight." And he says this in the context of a passage talking about knowledge, understanding that no matter how much knowledge we gain, no matter how much experience we gain, we can't simply correct the issues brought about by the fall. And so it's limited. In chapter 6, we see that it cannot tell a man what is the purpose of life or what comes after death. Knowledge alone cannot tell us what our purpose is or what comes after death, right? There's a reason that science can't tell us what the afterlife looks like. We can't know these things by purely human means. And in chapter 7, we see that the preacher says he had all these deep questions. He had these deep theological, deep existential questions that knowledge alone could not answer, that wisdom, worldly wisdom alone, could not answer. So its first problem is that it's limited, and its second problem is that it just produces sinfulness in us. It just produces sinfulness in us. Again, looking back at chapter 1, verse 15, the parts of us that are crooked cannot be made straight by knowledge, by wisdom, by all these things. Experience cannot stop you from being a sinful person. Knowledge cannot stop you from being a sinful person, right? We used historical illustrations for this. We used practical illustrations of this, seeing people give each other advice that just leads to further sinfulness and selfishness. And so we need to understand those inherent limitations with knowledge, that when we seek knowledge outside of God, we replace God with knowledge and experience. Those limitations will hold us back always. So those are the issues. Those are the issues that the preacher acknowledges. And we see how Christ solves those issues. Christ being himself incarnate, pure wisdom, true wisdom. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1 that Christ is the wisdom of God. So we see that from eternity past, the truest wisdom that there would ever be in this entire universe would be Christ crucified, Christ himself, the plan of redemption. That is the most wise and most knowledgeable thing we could ever understand. And then we also see in John 10:27 that Christ teaches us wisdom. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the preacher says that the collected sayings of wisdom come from one shepherd. And in the translations, that shepherd is capitalized, showing it refers to God. In John 10:27, Jesus says that he is the good shepherd, and he says, "My sheep know me and they follow me. They hear my voice." And so our application for the week was that we need to learn to listen for the voice of our shepherd. We need to learn to listen for the voice of our shepherd. We need to test every piece of wisdom we receive to see if it's truly the voice of our shepherd or not. And our other application was that we need to seek knowledge to seek God, not the other way around. We don't seek knowledge instead of seeking God. We don't replace God with the pursuit of knowledge. We seek knowledge to know more about God. That's how we put it back in its proper place. So that's what we talked about. That's how we broke it down. Very fascinating discussion. If your student missed it, go back and find it on this channel so that they can watch it and be ready for next week as well. So to follow up on this topic, I would read James chapter 3. There's a very specific portion of that chapter where James talks about the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom of heaven. And ask your student, how do you test? How do you test the wisdom that you hear? How do you test the knowledge that you hear? How do you test for Jesus's voice? Help them to see that we test wisdom, we test knowledge, we test advice by its fruit. By its fruit. If someone gives you advice that you know will lead purely to selfishness, then you know that that's not godly wisdom. That's not godly advice. That's not godly counsel. If someone gives you advice or counsel or wisdom that produces the fruit listed by James there, then we get to say, yes, I do think that is godly counsel. I do think that's godly advice. Help your student to be ready for the very practical task of assessing the things they hear, listening for Christ's voice in advice, and counsel, in knowledge, and information that they receive always. So that is all I have for you this week. Next week, there will not be any actual youth group because we will be going out and doing some service projects for some people in the church. So please look at the email for details about that. Get excited for that. Please free your calendar for that. It's going to be wonderful. If you have any questions or anything for me, please let me know. Otherwise, see you next time.